Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're just so grateful that you can be with us here today. We're going to spend some time in the first hour really just kind of helping you understand how to understand the Bible, how to actually interpret the Bible, and how to go about your Bible study. Thought it'd be a very practical session that you would certainly appreciate. Next hour, we're going to do just a little bit of time looking at the issue of homelessness. And now the reason we're doing that is twofold. First of all, our latest issue just came out in the Outlook magazine is that. And so we certainly wanted you to be watching for that if it hasn't already arrived in your particular home. Number two, it is an ongoing issue, and we are convinced that as Christians we should apply the whole counsel of God to every area, and we'll get into that as well. Then we'll back way into the news. We've had, of course, a couple of days now to hear from the nominee to the Supreme Court, and Judge Jackson has made some interesting comments that both would encourage us and probably concern us, and we'll get into some of that as well. And also, we have posted quite a number of other articles that we'll do our best to try to cover. If we don't cover them today, we'll cover them Thursday, or certainly our Friday roundtable discussion as well. So lots of things we'll be talking about in these next 2 hours, and especially this first hour. If you have comments or questions about maybe Bible interpretation, understanding the Bible, getting the scope of the Bible, and much more, we wanted that to be something that you could have access to as well. So we'll open up the phones, 800-351-1212. We are bringing to the microphone an individual that has actually been a professor and teacher at Moody Bible Institute for many years, Dr. William Marty. Been there more than 40 years, I might just mention. Has been involved in teaching Old Testament survey, New Testament survey to freshmen on that campus there in Chicago. We are talking about this book, The Whole Bible Story, everything that happens in the Bible in plain English. It is an illustrated version, and we have information about that on our website, which I think you will benefit from. Published by Baker, and I might just mention some of his previous books, The World of Jesus, The Jesus Story, and even co-authoring a book on the Quick Start Guide to the Whole Bible. And Dr. Marty, it is a delight to have you on the program.
Good afternoon, Kerby. Glad to be with you.
Let's first of all just explain to people why those of you that teach in Bible colleges, those of us that sometimes get a chance to speak in a seminary or whatever, why we even do Old Testament survey and New Testament survey. It's because, as you illustrate in this book, the need for us to put all of the various verses and chapters and books in the Bible in a cohesive way. And that's one of the reasons why it's one of the first courses some of the freshmen that go to Moody Bible Institute actually take.
Yes, that's correct. And years ago, a long time ago now, when I first had a survey course, it was really rapid analysis of each book, like Genesis, Exodus, and so forth. And I didn't know at that time that I would ever become a Bible professor, but through God's leading, I ended up at Moody Bible Institute. And one of the things that I decided that I wouldn't do is rapid analysis. And so I put together my courses in Old Testament and New Testament so that they told the whole story of the Bible, because the Bible does tell a story. It is composed of 66 books, but it also gives a story, a great, wonderful, incredible plan of God's grace and love. And so that's the way I taught my course, both Old Testament and New Testament. Instead of going book by book, I told the story. And I actually required the students to write out their own storyline of both Old and New Testament. And I joked with them when I wrote the whole Bible story. I said, I actually took your reading reports and put them in a book. but I think it's important that people realize that the Bible does tell a story, and you don't necessarily get that perspective by just studying an individual book. And that's why survey is so important.
Again, 66 books from Genesis to Revelation. But again, you point out early on in this particular book, the whole Bible story, that the storyline sometimes is hard to follow because the books are not necessarily always recorded in chronological order. So you do have to do a little bit of interpretation there. But it also brings us to one of the key principles in biblical interpretation. Context matters a great deal. And my joke always is, I can do all things through Christ through verses taken out of context, because we sometimes have seen that we are individually looking at one verse. And if you're going to teach through Philippians or Colossians, I recommend to people before they get into the verses to read the whole epistle. Even better, to read the whole New Testament or whatever, so that you get a sense of context, because this is one of the biggest problems I think we run into. Christians sometimes take a verse out of context, and don't the cultists themselves also take one verse out of context without understanding the meaning of that and developing, if you will, a whole false doctrine on some of those ideas. So again, it underscores why you've written the book, The Whole Bible Story, isn't it?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the context is important, and it gives, not only does it prevent people from misapplying or misinterpreting Scripture, but it helps people to better understand an individual passage, even a verse, if they know why it was written. I'm doing a study right now on parables. I actually wrote a book on the parables of Jesus, and I'm doing a small group Bible study on parables. And one of the things that I do for each of the studies is to give the people the context. You know, why did Jesus tell this story? Was he telling it for his disciples? Was he challenging the religious leaders and that sort of thing?
Well, let's see if we can take a break.
Context is absolutely important.
Well, I need to take a break, but when we come back, I thought what we do is kind of break it down. Your first 5 chapters really kind of get into the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, and then maybe some aspects of the Old Testament and some principles we can learn there. And then eventually we'll work our way into the New Testament and then trying to make a sense of what's happening with the church and the book of Acts and the other epistles, and finally with the book of Revelation. And so my goal here is to try to provide an opportunity for individuals who will not enroll in your course, obviously, to maybe get just a little bit of a sense of why these Old Testament survey, New Testament survey classes are so important, why they're required in Bible colleges and seminaries, and why it would be good for all of us to have that kind of background. And if you find yourself saying, well, I would really kind of enjoy this book, it is fairly thick, but it's not that expensive, about 350 pages, but it's illustrated, and I love that as well. Some of you will never make your way over to Israel, and so trying to get a sense of how the land looks, how it may have looked at the time of Moses or the time of David or Jesus, some of this is very helpful there as well. And then a number of maps and charts and all sorts of other things that will help you, if nothing else, prevent you from making some of the mistakes that other people have made in the past. So we're privileged to have with us this hour Dr. William Marty. A little bit later, if you have a comment or a question, of course, we'd love to welcome your phone calls, 800-351-1212. Individual that's taught at Moody Bible Institute for 40 years, and we can gain so much wisdom from him, and that will begin right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Economists have debated this question for centuries. What is money? Most of us assume that money is a store of value. You can put your money in the bank and you can draw that money out when you need it. Money is also a medium of exchange. You can give dollars to someone for the goods and services you need. But what if your government or another government declares that your money is no longer worth anything and can no longer be used? As we've seen over the last few weeks, this is not a theoretical question. The U.S. and its allies have been able to freeze Russian financial accounts and shut off the Russian central bank's access to hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. Our collective reaction to this has been positive because we want to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. At the same time, I also like to remind my audience that the people most hurt by these actions are the Russian people, many who disagree with Vladimir Putin's invasion. Last year, the International Monetary Fund suspended the Taliban's access to various funds and financial instruments. Again, we can agree with that because of the horrible actions of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we even have used financial sanctions against Iran because we're concerned about their actions and attempts to develop a nuclear bomb. But we need only look to Canada to see how bank accounts and other financial accounts were frozen by Justin Trudeau. It is possible that you may not even have agreed with the truckers, but I hope you can see how this trend of freezing accounts could affect you one day. We may applaud some of the actions that governments are taking against our enemies, but someday you might be on the wrong side of a government and have your bank account frozen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking today with Dr. William Marty. Might just mention that his book, The Whole Bible Story, came out in 2011. Then Baker Books republished it, and now you have a repackaged edition in 2021. And so, again, the illustrated edition is one I think you will really appreciate with. And, again, we have information about that on our website. Of course, you can perhaps even find it in your local bookstore. But, Dr. Marty, let's, if we can, maybe get started. And the first 5 books of the Bible take it from creation to, of course, Moses and the Exodus and the establishment of the nation of Israel. There's a lot to
rebelled against God, and we have what we call the fall or the fall into sin. But God immediately initiated a plan of redemption, and that story is carried out through Genesis and sort of comes to a high point with the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Years ago, one of my professors told me that that's the most important chapter in the whole Bible. Because God said that he would bless Abraham, he would bless his descendants, but then he made this incredible promise that through Abraham, he would bless everyone. He'd bless all the people of the world. And what's amazing about the Bible is how it's connected together. And so when we turn to the New Testament, to the first book, Matthew, we read in the very first verse that this is the genealogy of Christ. He's the son of David, and he's the son of Abraham. And so how did God fulfill his promise to bless the whole world? He did it through his son, Jesus Christ. Then the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, give the story of God's people in Egypt when they were in slavery. And I raised up Moses to redeem them or to free them from slavery. And then he gave them the law at Mount Sinai, and that became their guiding principle for life that he would give them eventually in the Promised Land. And then, of course, the Pentateuch ends with the death of Moses, but that's not the end of God's people, because he raised up Joshua to lead the people into the Promised Land. And then we're just off and running with the rest of the story in the Old Testament.
And again, I love that, because even when you get to chapter 6, Promised Land, you talk about Joshua, you have a picture of the Jordan River. I mean, some people have seen it just as a little trickle, so this gives you an idea of what it probably looked a little bit more like. And of course, you have, of course, taking the land, but not necessarily being completely obedient. And then that takes us into the judges and a kingdom. Before we get to that, it's an important principle that you just mentioned in passing, I thought we'd pick up on, and that is we have 66 books written on essentially almost 3 continents, certainly in 3 different languages during at least a 1,500-year period. And one of the most striking arguments for the inspiration of God's Word is from Genesis to Revelation. There's just one theme. There is just one message. The argument that I sometimes get from our atheist friends that there are contradictions in the Bible, I think are pretty easily resolved. And I think it shows God's fingerprint that whether you're reading in Genesis, whether you're reading in the New Testament, whether you're reading something Daniel says or something later that John has in the Revelation, it all comes together and all makes sense, and I think gives really the fingerprints of the fact that it is divine revelation, don't you think?
I fully agree, and I think that one of the strong arguments for the inspiration of Scripture is the continuity that we see through the whole Bible. It's not like the Reader's Digest. You look at a Reader's Digest, there's all kinds of short stories in there, and there's stories in the Bible, but they're all connected with the theme of obedience brings blessing, and disobedience will bring judgment. But even the greater theme is God's amazing love and his grace in redeeming fallen humanity. When we get into the judges, as you mentioned, everyone was just a dismal failure, except for the first judge, who was a woman, and then the last judge, who was Samuel. And Samuel prepared Israel for a kingdom. We had David and Solomon, and then Solomon blew it, and the kingdom was divided. But even after the division of the kingdom, and when the kingdom of Judah went into exile, God still hadn't abandoned his people. And so we have those books after the exile that set the stage for the coming of Christ in the New Testament. And all the prophets, and even in the Psalms, we have these predictions and promises that God will send a son, and his son will suffer and die, but he will establish a kingdom of righteousness and peace that will last forever.
Let's see if we can maybe for another few minutes kind of stay on David and Solomon, maybe even Saul as well, because sometimes we've said that Saul didn't have a heart for God, David had a heart for God, and Solomon had half a heart for God. But I think
right.
Whether you look at those 3 individuals, or as you were alluding to just a minute ago, the separate difference between Israel and Judah, we have, I would have to say, Dr. Marty, lots of evidence that illustrates that even in a godly kingdom like Israel, we have to believe in greed, ambition, basically sin nature, because it shows up time and time again in the Old Testament. And I think if I might just inject one more thing about divine inspiration, if you've read some of these biographies and autobiographies of some of these famous people over the 20th century, they just gloss over all of their mistakes and all of their failings and all the rest.
Right.
But boy, when you get into, I don't care if it's Saul or David or Solomon or any of the kings, most of whom were reprobates, you get the full story, don't you?
Absolutely. And I can't remember who said it, but someone said that the Bible records the story of people, warts and all. And so it doesn't try to gloss over people's failures. But that's part of the amazing story of the Bible, because we see that in spite of their wickedness, their greed, and their rebellion against God, God is still merciful. And of course, if we're honest, we all are a bit greedy, and we all are disobedient at times. But the amazing story is that God is gracious and He's forgiving and loving. And even in the case of David, who is the king after God's own heart, he sinned, and we can read his prayers of confession in Scripture. And God in His grace restored him to his kingship, and he served God and became known as the king after God's own heart. The big contrast between David and the other kings is that when they sinned, they never repented.
Yes.
David sinned, but he repented.
And again, let me just encourage you. Of course, I love this book, but there is a whole section on the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. If you've always had trouble kind of sorting all of that out, or we'll probably mention just a little bit when we come back from the break, God's people in exile, because, of course, that takes us to Daniel and a number of others, and as well as the prophets. We'll talk about that. But then we'll move, of course, into the New Testament. But if you've always had trouble kind of sorting this out and wondering, why do we have so much of that in the Old Testament? First of all, you can actually begin to learn some lessons vicariously, especially if we go all the way back to Genesis. You see the broken branches of people's family trees, and you can see some of the problems that Abraham has goes to Isaac and Jacob, and you begin to understand how important it is to have a family legacy. Of course, you learn a great deal about God's unfolding revelation as it comes to what we'll talk about after the break here, as well as the life of Jesus, his ministry, and how we break that down into various sections. And then eventually we will move our way into, of course, the church age and what happened in terms of the church and how we can apply that, and as we look to the future in the book of Revelation. So all part of what's called the illustrated edition of the whole Bible story. Dr. William Marty is the author. Might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but again, it is published by Baker, and it's a resource that I think would really help you understand the Bible and put it all in a context. And if you've just kind of dipped in here and there and just read bits and pieces of the Bible, this might help you put all of those 66 books together and make sense of them. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. William Marty, and we might take some phone calls if you'd like to join us. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half-century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Story@pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. William Marty. Again, an individual that has been a teacher at Moody Bible Institute for 40 years, author of a number of books. But this one, we're talking about the illustrated edition of the whole Bible story, everything that happens in the Bible in plain English, published by Baker. And we have information about it on our website. Most likely you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. And I would certainly commend it to you if you want to understand more about kind of Old Testament survey. And now we're going to do New Testament survey. And Dr. Marty, first of all, we have to admit that the next 6 chapters are all about the life of Jesus, which makes sense because you take us from the birth and childhood, then his early ministry, his ministry in Galilee, as well as then his ministry in Judea and Jerusalem, all the way to his crucifixion and resurrection. And that's important because, after all, that's what the Bible is all about, pointing to the coming Messiah and then the culmination. But when you teach New Testament survey, obviously, I would imagine you spend a lot of time on Jesus. So help us understand how to maybe break that out in terms of the Gospels, because we, again, have people saying, well, why don't we just have one record of Jesus? Why do we have 4 Gospels and those kinds of things? Can you answer some of those basic questions for us?
Yes, we do have 4 Gospels, and they all tell the story of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar to one another, so they're called the Synoptic Gospels because they basically look at the life of Jesus from the same perspective. The Gospel of John is different. It's more theological and interpretive. It has more about the theological significance, that's a big word, the doctrinal significance of Jesus' life. So in order to get the full story of the life of Christ, we need all 4 Gospels. And so what I did in the book is I told the story of the life of Christ from different periods or segments of his life, like his birth and his childhood, and then his early ministry, and Galilean ministry and Judean ministry and so forth, leading up then to his Passion Week with his teaching in the upper room, and then his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, his arrest, of course, trials, death, and then most of all 4 Gospels record the resurrection. So what people will find in the book is the storyline of the life of Christ with focus on some of his significant teaching.
Let's, if we can, maybe even point out.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a great deal of sense. And I was just thinking, since you do have a section here on his Galilean ministry, we have from time to time had various trips that we've taken to Israel, and whether they've come with Point of View or come with Moody Bible Institute, Charlie Dyer does such a great job, as well as all sorts of pastors and others. What is so encouraging is when you go to the Galilean area, I mean, we obviously have roads and things like that, but you can at least kind of get a little bit of an idea of what it was like when Jesus was there. You have a picture, for example, of that synagogue at Capernaum. Now, this is not the one that existed when Jesus was there. It was built on top of it, but it still gives you a sense of what it might have been like to be a fisherman, what it may have been like to have walked through this whole area of the Galilee. And as a result, that, I think, is really helpful for people because you really can say, I'm pretty sure I'm walking where Jesus walked.
Right, exactly. And I was just looking through the book, The Whole Bible Story Illustrated, and I was looking again at some of the pictures, the charts, and the maps that they put in there, and they're very helpful. Like you just mentioned, the pictures give you a sense of what Galilee and the other areas of Israel were like in Jesus' time. And then there's charts that help you with chronology, and there's some other illustrations in there that help people to put it all together, to get the big picture, the storyline of the New Testament.
You have a chapter, of course, that deals with, of course, his later ministry in Judea as well as in Jerusalem. And when people go to Jerusalem, one of the things they say is, well, this is different because, of course, there have been so many times when Jerusalem has been destroyed and it's built one on top of the other. You take him down to the pool of Bethesda, and they go, that down there is where Jesus was. We're up here now. So obviously what you do, and I appreciate this about the book. Again, it's hard to show this on radio, but people can get a copy and begin to see. You show us what Jerusalem was at the time of Jesus. Of course, you also have chapters there on what Jerusalem was like at the time of Solomon, and then all sorts of other aspects of this, so that even if you've never had a chance to go to the Holy Land, never been able to go to Israel, you have a pretty good idea of what that looks like. And then you even include some things which are like the traditional. Now, as soon as you hear the traditional, you have to take it with a grain of salt. But for example, the traditional tomb of Lazarus, or the traditional site of, this and that or the other, that is helpful because it just, again, brings this to life. There's a sense in which people, when they read the Bible and they've never been to Israel, it's like reading it maybe in black and white. You go to that, you see where the hills are, you see what it took, where all that takes place. It sort of puts it out in living color. And your book does a pretty good job, I'd have to say, of helping people, if they've never been to Israel, understand what it was like during the time of Jesus.
Right. You mentioned the traditional site. Immediately, it came to my mind that we have the Garden Tomb, where there are tombs like the one that Jesus was buried in, but the people who manage the Garden Tomb will quickly tell you that this probably wasn't the place where Jesus was buried, but it was like that. But as you mentioned, by looking at these pictures, you get a sense of what Jerusalem was like in Jesus' day. And unfortunately, as you said, Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt several times, and then different religious groups have built churches and other types of structures on all of these places, so you don't know exactly what they look like originally.
That's very true. Well, we're getting close to Easter, so I thought, chapter 17 really takes us through the Passion Week, the triumphal entry, the cleansing of the temple, the day of controversy, as well as the Passover upper room. Of course, that takes us then to the crucifixion and resurrection. But again, people have a chance to go to an olive grove in the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe it didn't look exactly like that, but it gives you at least a feel for what was happening during that week leading up to the crucifixion. And then, of course, we don't want to leave Jesus in the grave, his resurrection. So what should we know about those particular chapters in your book?
Well, I think that's really the highlight of the Bible. When you look at the book of Acts and the epistles, everything that the writers say, Luke for Acts and Paul and so forth for the epistles, is based on the fact that Jesus is alive. I mean, there is no story after the four Gospels if Jesus were in the grave, but the tomb is empty. And again, the writers of the New Testament refer to the fact that our salvation is based on the fact that Jesus not only lived and died, but that he rose again. And I think you get a sense of the importance of the resurrection when you see the transformation that happened to Jesus' followers after the resurrection. At the end of his life, they're kind of cringing in fear. But then when they discover that he's alive, they proclaim the gospel with incredible boldness and confidence that Jesus is not a dead but a living Savior. And that's what you see in the first part of Acts and Peter's message on the day of Pentecost.
We'll talk about that after the break, because you even have a picture there, which sometimes will give a little message there on the steps where it's quite likely, I think probably reasonable, in the southern steps of the Temple Mount where Peter gave his sermon. And then when they baptized people, probably baptized there in the mikvahs and some of that. But anyway, we'll get into a little bit of the book of Acts after the break. But again, if you just happen to join us, been talking about this book. It's been out for a while, but this illustrated version may be one that you would like, because it gives you not only the very good content from Dr. William Marty, but also some great pictures, the kind of pictures that some of us when we travel to Israel take. And if you wanted to have this one and use this as your Bible study, or maybe even just as you go through it, essentially benefit from a man who has been teaching for 4 decades, if you can believe it, things like Old Testament survey and New Testament survey. So again, we have some information about it on the website, and next hour we're going to get into some other topics, but thought you might like to learn a little bit more about how to study God's Word, how to put all the pieces together, and that's why this book, The Whole Bible Story, is one that I think you might enjoy getting a copy of. We'll take a break. Be right back.
Now, back to Point of View.
your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, for a few more minutes, Dr. William Marty with us as we talk about his illustrated edition of the whole Bible story. And that takes us, of course, to the rest of the New Testament, in particular the book of Acts, the story of the church. And first of all, I mentioned that, of course, we have Peter giving a sermon on the southern steps of the Temple Mount, so you can actually see that. But more importantly, what is so intriguing is on a number of occasions, we've not only had tours that we've done, and I know you've done this at Moody Bible Institute and others, showing where Jesus walked, but also where Paul walked. And the good news is that if you go to places like Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, and some others, again, you can see kind of what it looked like when the church was beginning and what the travels of Peter and, of course, Paul and Philip and others. You have whole maps and diagrams and even some pictures to give you a little bit of an idea of, indeed, how this band of Jesus followers ultimately completely dominated the Roman world within a few centuries. And so, again, that's an incredible story as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And you mentioned that, we have critics of Scripture. And one of, I think, the powerful arguments for the integrity of the Bible is the transformation that took place in the followers of Christ after his resurrection. I mean, very few people would have died for a lie. And so when Peter and the other disciples were challenged to give up their faith, they said, no way. We know Jesus is alive, and we can't help but telling that wonderful story. And I don't think there's any other way to explain their courage other than the fact that they were absolutely certain that Jesus was alive. And then you have the conversion of the Apostle Paul, which is recorded in Acts chapter 9, when he was a persecutor of the church, and
Yes.
he was confronted by Christ on the road to Damascus, and he was totally transformed. He became a fervent follower of the Lord Jesus Christ.
One of the other things, since we're talking about the book of Acts written by Luke, of course, the gospel written by Luke as well. And you know as well as I do that a lot of our liberal friends, and I put that in quotes, at some of these liberal seminaries and even some of these secular historians have always been critical of Luke, because after all, if you can show that he got some particular statement in the book of Acts or some statement in the gospel wrong, it just illustrates again that it was not an accurate record. And yet it's been interesting for me, Dr. Marty, seeing time and time again, since you and I guess are the two old guys around the table here, of those individuals that have criticized Luke, saying, well, Luke and the Bible says this, but secular history says this. And then time and time again, we find a historical document. Many times we find an archaeological discovery, and we say, no, I guess it's wrong. Luke was right, the Bible was right, and the skeptics were wrong. And that's been going on for decades, and I think you've probably been paying attention to it as much as I have.
Yes, I have. And what's interesting about the Gospel of Luke, and then, of course, I would include the book of Acts because it's a continuation of
Yes.
Luke, is that Luke has a prologue to his Gospel, and he tells us how he researched the material that he wanted to use for the life of Christ, and he researched it carefully, not carelessly, but carefully. And he's the only gospel writer that tells us the process that he used to tell us the story of Christ, and then, of course, of the church. And as you mentioned, archaeologists often use Scripture, not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament, for some of their archaeological research because of the historical accuracy of the Bible. I had the privilege of ministering in Russia for a year.
Wow.
As part of co-mission to speak in what they call convocations to teachers who were not Christians. And I told them that I had been to to Israel, to the land of the Bible, and I had seen these places, and they were absolutely amazed. They said, the communists told us that Jesus was a myth. But I said, no, I've actually seen the places where Jesus walked, and it was a very powerful testimony to people who had thought that, the stories of the Bible was just a lot of nonsense.
So good. Well, you end with an epilogue, and it has to do with the fact that when you finally get into near the end of the first century, the Roman Emperor Domitian demanded loyalty and worship and all the rest. And, of course, John is still alive. He's arrested, banished to this small island of Patmos, which is off the coast of Asia Minor, and there has this vision, which is, of course, the book of Revelation. It is the revelation to John. You even have a picture there of the cave, which is sort of the traditional site of John's vision. And I think you end with the fact that it really isn't the end of the story. It may be just the beginning, because we look forward to a time in which, as that all unfolds, we have a new heaven and a new earth, and we go from creation, fall, redemption, and ultimately restoration. But finish with that, because that, again, is a look at the 66 books of the Bible, but especially the book of Revelation is looking to the future, is it not?
Sure. I just told my wife this morning, as we were thinking about world events that are unfolding not only in Ukraine but in our country and so forth, and I said, well, there's one thing that we know for sure. There will always be a church until Christ returns, and that's how the book of Revelation ends. John has this vision of Christ in the first chapter, and Christ is alive. He's the first and the last. He's the Alpha and the Omega, and he's alive and he lives forevermore. And then the book tells us about events that will take place near the end of the age, and how Christ will one day return, and he will establish God's eternal kingdom, and he'll rule as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And then what's fascinating, Kerby, about the chapter on the book of Revelation is that all that was lost in the fall in the Garden of Eden, there's a parallel between the description in Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden and what eternity will be like in the end of the book of Revelation. And what was lost through man's rebellion against God is all reestablished, regained through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we'll spend eternity with him. It's hard to think about how long eternity is, but that's the hope that we have.
So again, the book is entitled The Whole Bible Story, Everything That Happens in the Bible in Plain English. This is the illustrated version. Of course, you can get some of the others as well, but the one we happen to be mentioning, the one that Baker Books has put out, which is illustrated, very, very good. And I think it is one that you should be able to find in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got some information about some of these on the website at pointofview.net. The Whole Bible Story.
Kerby, could I just make one brief announcement?
Please.
Just this last year, they published a young readers edition of the Whole Bible Story. Troy Smith rewrote my academic version in a story that is for young readers ages 7 to 14, and it has wonderful illustrations in it. And the hope is that we can get the Bible into the hands of young people in plain English that they can understand.
Well, again, we're going to take a break, and you can do a search. We'll see if we can put some of that up as well. But again, we've been privileged to have with us today Dr. William Marty. When we come back, Ivy Nichols will be joining us. We're going to talk about homelessness and then all sorts of issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, Make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time this first half hour talking about homelessness, and I'll get into more why we're doing that in just a minute. Then we'll talk about these hearings that have been taking place with Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for the next placement on the Supreme Court. She is currently a judge, and I suspect most people suspect that very soon she will be a justice on the Supreme Court. But we're going to be talking about this issue of homelessness for a couple of reasons. First of all, the April issue of Outlook, which we send out to our donors, is going to arrive soon in your mailbox, and I hope that this is something that you do receive. As a matter of fact, in about a week and a half or so, we're going to be doing our Truth Team, and one of the things we talk about is if you would want to support Point of View, and I recognize only a very small percentage of the listeners do, we send the Outlook magazine to you on a regular basis. So that's one reason to cover it. The other is I just think we as Christians have to think about every area of life, and you may not ever have heard a Christian program talk about homelessness. Well, you're going to hear this hour. So that is certainly the case, and the reason that we are covering that is we did an entire issue. I wrote one on homelessness in one city. We have across from me here, and we'll introduce her in just a minute, Ivy Nichols, on tackling homelessness, and then Liberty McCarter wrote one on addressing root causes, and so it's an important issue. Ivy Nichols has been with us before. She actually serves not only as one of the writers for Outlook magazine, she's kind of our event planner, organizer, and all the rest, as one of the summer scholars, a graduate of Howard Payne University, and joins me in studio. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me first, before I even get into your piece, mention that one book that I found fairly helpful in this regard is called San Francisco. Now, that is a funny title, but it's written by Michael Schellenberger. We've talked about him before because he wrote a very good book called Apocalypse Never. Now, he's an environmentalist, but it was kind of interesting that eventually he got a little bit tired of some of the environmental extremism, and so at least tried to set the record straight, and thus caused many people to criticize him. He actually works with an organization that is located in Berkeley, California. I know that area very well, by the way. And he always used to support things like drug legalization and thought that, you know, if we believe in liberty, certainly people should be able to walk on the streets. Well, you can tell by the title of the book that he has kind of had a change in worldview. Now, he is an individual who would describe himself as a liberal progressive, wouldn't necessarily agree with lots of things we talk about on this program, but nevertheless points out that California generally, in San Francisco Bay Area in particular, have a problem. And many of you that are listening in some of the western states have seen this, especially it tends to be in those states which, first of all, have a housing problem and also tend to have a warmer climate. And so that's, of course, California and Oregon and Hawaii, but it's also some of you listeners in Florida have seen the same thing. And so then I thought it was interesting that when he was doing an interview with John Stossel says, well, this is happening in every city. He says, no, it's not. It's happening in San Francisco. It's not happening in Carmel because, after all, they have a different set of rules and regulations there. And so you can see that this is a issue that needs to be addressed. And so I thought we would take it on. So, Ivy, let me come to your article first, Tackling Homelessness. The first section you dealt with is panhandlers. I have given to panhandlers, probably tend to do that more than most, because if they have a need, I really want to help them. But at the same time, you've been studying some of this whole idea of professional panhandling. What have you found?
So actually where we're located, Point of View's office, we do have quite a bit of panhandlers around here.
Yes.
So as we're driving to and from work, usually we'll encounter them and they'll, look at us or be yelling at people in the streets and everything. And it's very hard to see people in such a difficult situation and not automatically want to give them, money, at least $5 or something, or food. So it's always kind of a moral question of what do you do when you see those people? So I think that based on research from different homeless organizations, you can give them money if you feel led. And, of course, it's a personal question. But the better thing to do is to donate to homeless organizations that are really helping them.
Very good
and
idea.
to food banks. Another thing is there's a great organization locally in the Dallas area called Our Calling, which has a homeless directory. And it has information on different resources that different homeless people could use. So that's another great thing that you can buy in bulk online and give out to people, or even make homeless bags with things like socks and gloves, which you can get for pretty cheaply at Walmart, and maybe even include a New Testament and some snacks and other necessities in that bag.
You had a great example, just even what's going on in Denver. We do have some listeners in Colorado area where if people ask for money, they've turned old parking meters into donation boxes and things of that nature. So that is one issue. And of course, let's just be honest. I'll say this right now, and this really shows up quite a bit in our article on homelessness. Some of that has to do with the lack of housing, but a lot more of it has to do with drug and alcohol addiction. And, it's interesting because, again, Michael Schellenberger was really very much for legalizing all sorts of drugs until he began to see the impact that it was having even in his own community, and how he was assaulted and some of his people were assaulted, and began to think about that. But let's get to the second point that you make, because it's very good, because sometimes there is a problem with housing. Some people are homeless because they don't want to be under any kind of rules and regulations. Some find themselves in a position where the lowest price for a house is the lowest rung on the ladder is beyond their reach. And so there's really two kinds of homelessness, aren't there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. There are some people that, have alcohol and drug addictions or a mental illness, especially. There's a huge percentage of homeless people that suffer from those. But there are also people that are regular people that have had something bad happen to them and really need help. So I think that that's the place where shelters can, and many do, step in to not only provide housing, but some of those people also need job training. Some of them that are willing to get out of addiction or need mental illness help or physical illness help if they've had some illness that's taken, so much of their money that they're not able to afford basic necessities.
Right.
I think organizations can definitely help with that.
You've got a piece here, too, from the Manhattan Institute. We've had some of their experts on here as well. And part of the complication is they have preferences for the kind of housing they want. Back in the days when we didn't have a lot of housing for the homeless, they knew they'd go into a hotel and they were ready to go. But once they said, oh, well, if it's a homeless shelter, I don't know, there's just too many restrictions. And so sometimes we're dealing with people with PTSD. Sometimes we're dealing with drug abuse. Sometimes we're dealing with alcoholism. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer. But one of the things I love about your piece, and it's one of the 3 articles in our April issue, is you really help us understand that there are different answers for some of the issues of homelessness. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about maybe some of the causes of homelessness and maybe some of the possible solutions. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd kind of like to read this because I am working with a homeless shelter, or I wanted to know more about that, let me hold this up. Even if you make a donation, of course, you receive this automatically. But even if you say, look, I would just like to get a copy of it, you could certainly contact us at Point of View, and I'm sure we'd be glad to get you one. Those of you listening right now, this may have arrived at your mailbox. Probably it's on the way. And I thought it'd be a good way to get you interested in this, and also just a good way for you to get to know Ivy, because we love Ivy and all that she's doing around here. So we'll continue talking about her article, and I'll mention a few from my article. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Economists have debated this question for centuries. What is money? Most of us assume that money is a store of value. You can put your money in the bank and you can draw that money out when you need it. Money is also a medium of exchange. You can give dollars to someone for the goods and services you need. But what if your government or another government declares that your money is no longer worth anything and can no longer be used? As we've seen over the last few weeks, this is not a theoretical question. The U.S. and its allies have been able to freeze Russian financial accounts and shut off the Russian central bank's access to hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. Our collective reaction to this has been positive because we want to punish Russia for invading Ukraine. At the same time, I also like to remind my audience that the people most hurt by these actions are the Russian people, many who disagree with Vladimir Putin's invasion. Last year, the International Monetary Fund suspended the Taliban's access to various funds and financial instruments. Again, we can agree with that because of the horrible actions of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we even have used financial sanctions against Iran because we're concerned about their actions and attempts to develop a nuclear bomb. But we need only look to Canada to see how bank accounts and other financial accounts were frozen by Justin Trudeau. It is possible that you may not even have agreed with the truckers, but I hope you can see how this trend of freezing accounts could affect you one day. We may applaud some of the actions that governments are taking against our enemies, but someday you might be on the wrong side of a government and have your bank account frozen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, once again, talking about homelessness, and I got quoted from the book San Francisco for just a minute because there's a great quote in there from Bill Maher. Who would have thought that we've been quoting Bill Maher so much here on Point of View? But, you know, he said something the other day. I came out here in 1983. I found paradise. I love California. I do. I don't want to leave, but I feel like I'm living in Italy in the 1970s or something. I don't know what I'm getting for my super high taxes. California has the highest income tax, highest gasoline tax, the highest sales tax in the country. So in the midst of that, having grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I can relate to some of the things that Michael Schellenberger talks about, because he opens with a story about Harvey Milk. He's kind of an LGBTQ hero, but before he was kind of known for that, although he was known at the time for that, he actually won his election by actually introducing what was called Scoop the Poop Act. And the idea is that he actually took people through the parks and said, you know, we can't let the dogs do this in the park. And so he contrasts that with the current mayor of San Francisco leading a walking tour, and everybody's having to dodge the human leavings out there as well. And he points out, this is a number that was staggering to me, that each year San Francisco spends at least $100 million to clean the streets, which is 4 times what they spend for Chicago, and the area of Chicago is about 4.5 times larger. And also between 2015 and 2018, this is a statistic got all you women upset because it's interesting. San Francisco had to replace more than 300 lampposts corroded by urine because one of the lampposts collapsed and crushed a car. So can you imagine having to replace lampposts just because, of all of that? And it just illustrates that this is a threat to a person's liberty. The impact that it's having on some of the storefronts and all of the rest are all issues that need to be addressed. So I have in studio with me for a little bit longer, Ivy Nichols, and in your piece, which is so well written, you have a whole section on the causes of homelessness and then the solutions. So we'll talk about your causes and solutions. I'll add a few of my own. But first of all, when we see a homeless person, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. There are different causes. What did you find?
There are a lot of different causes that contribute to homelessness, and usually there's a combination of them that factor in for people, whether it's mental or physical illness or addiction to drugs or alcohol. Some people have experienced family abuse or trauma, especially young ladies, and maybe they're teenagers and they're running away from that and they don't really have anywhere else to turn to because they may not have other healthy relationships in their life of people that they could go and stay with to escape that. Some people have lost their jobs, maybe due to addiction, maybe due to just difficulties. But one underlying thing that we really do see is a lot of us face difficulties at life and sometime or another, but having people that we can rely on to help us through those difficult times is often what makes the difference between someone becoming homeless or someone just facing a rough patch. So that's something that a lot of homeless shelters are working with these people, is to not only help them find a home, but help them learn how to have a job and break their addictions and build stable relationships so that they can reintegrate into society.
You give us quite a list here, too, of if you look at those individuals that are homeless, a significant portion are, of course, dealing with drug or alcohol abuse, childhood abuse, behavior disorders, and family instability. As a matter of fact, while we talk about this, it is interesting because in our article, we talk about the fact that at least 500,000, probably much more than that, but I'll just use the statistical numbers, which I think are low. 500,000 Americans experience homelessness. Most of them, 70%, 7 out of every 10, are individuals, but we also see homeless with families, and those are significant as well. And then you have a significant percentage, almost 40%, that are under the age of 18. So when you add to these, everything from addictions and abuse and all that, and then, of course, PTSD from those who maybe have been in the military, lots of causes. And really, in a sense, that brings us to the last section that you have on solutions, because we have to have different solutions for different issues related to homelessness. Again, let's see if we can talk about some of the things that you've been able to uncover.
Well, one solution for cities is to strengthen current ordinances or set up other ones, because constitutionally, a lot of courts have a problem with banning panhandling because they believe it's an infringement on free speech. But they can still put certain restrictions up, like they can't ask for money after sunset or before sunrise or in certain areas of town, or they can't go to the bathroom on the streets, or certain restrictions, which of course are important for other people in society to be able to live safe and healthy lives. For the people who are homeless, of course, directing them to shelters is a great idea. Also requiring transparency from those shelters and having cities partner with ones that have proven records of success is very important, because some of them have had troubles with corruption in the past. So it's always good when government partners with an organization and gives them money to require transparency for that, and to require as high levels of safety and cleanliness from those places as possible, because some homeless individuals are hesitant to go to shelters because they believe they won't be safe or they won't be sanitary.
Let me mention some of the political solutions as well. My commentary there actually talks about a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case in which Boise, Idaho was trying to address homelessness. By the way, it's always assumed that homelessness is just in warm climates. I ran into homeless people when I was in Anchorage, Alaska. This one, of course, from Boise, Idaho, where snow is pretty deep, but there's still homeless people there. But in this case, they struck down an attempt to actually deal with people that would be sleeping on the sidewalks and camping helping out on those kinds of things. And of course, in my article, I also, in some of this coming from San Francisco, point out that when you have a district attorney, as you have in San Francisco, that actually has said that he wants to be engaged in de-incarceration, that means I want to close the jails and put as many people out there. We've always seen this before because, Ivy, one of the things we learned is that years ago there was this assumption that keeping a person in a mental institution violated their liberties. And I recognize that not everybody that suffers from a mental disease, about 52 million people in this country, about 13 million seriously mental disease, not all of them are dangerous to themselves or to others, but some are. And when you say, well, we just want to de-incarcerate individuals from the in the past, the mental institutions, now from the jails, you put those people out on the street, and guess what? We get hurt and harmed by that as well, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have had a friend that rolled down her window to try to help a homeless person or talk to him in a neighborhood, and he actually grabbed her and smashed her head against her steering wheel. So I do think that it's important when we're dealing with homeless people. Of course, we do want to help them, but to realize some of them may be unstable, and to make sure that we're doing that in a safe place, where there are other people around if we do choose to interact with them. Of course, most people are not going to react like that to someone that tries to help, but occasionally there may be that odd one that does.
And again, Michael Schellenberger talks about some places where he had some pretty close calls and some real difficult situations. And so you might say, well, what can we do about this? Well, first of all, you might want to ask your local law enforcement individuals, what kind of freedom did they have? You know, we've had this defund the police mantra going on for a long time. And those of us in the state of Texas, we've already had our midterm elections. But you're listening right now in any other state, you still have those elections. And you should ask, you know, maybe people in law enforcement, what freedoms do you have and what are you allowed to do or not allowed to do with homeless people? Maybe you should need to find out what your district attorney thinks about that particular issue. And if they're going to ask for your vote, you need to ask them some questions. And so, again, we recognize that homelessness is one more issue that we will address and will continue to follow here on Point of View. And if nothing else, Ivy, thank you for your writing your article. This one is called Tackling Homelessness, and appreciate you coming in today and sharing a little bit more about what you've been able to learn.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, let's get into a couple of other issues. You've got, of course, Judge Jackson being cross-examined. She had a little bit of difficulty telling us what a woman was and a little bit of difficulty telling us when life begins. But apart from that, she actually gave answers that sounded like she was actually believing in a constitutional originalism. What's that all about? So we'll try to sort some of that out. And you will notice we've posted a couple of very good articles today. One, how to deal with inflation. This is from Bloomberg. They're saying, well, inflation stings, especially for those of you who make under $300,000 a year, which is like all of us. Okay, and it's really a little demeaning, but nevertheless, that's the case. New York Times got in trouble for actually saying America has a free speech problem. I think it does, and it was a pretty good article, and they have been pilloried on that. And then one on all the scandals that would involve President Biden that are now being discovered on Hunter Biden's laptop. So you want to read some of those articles, and last half hour we'll do our best to try to cover some of those, but if we don't get to all of it, it's on the website already. You can read them at your leisure. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net. or call 800-347-5151. Story@pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about the confirmation hearings for Judge Jackson. Ketanji Brown Jackson is a liberal. I'm sure she'll be a consistent vote for the liberal wing of the Supreme Court. That being said, it's kind of interesting because she could not admit to some of her literal ideas. So either she believes those and is going to surprise Democrats, and we've talked about before, that has not happened. There are many a Republican president that actually is surprised by his nominee to the Supreme Court. I don't think there's ever been a Democratic president that has been surprised, but there's always a first time, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But let's first of all acknowledge that this is an individual who is very bright. She went to Harvard University, went to Harvard Law School, yet she has trouble answering some basic questions like, for example, what is a woman? Senator Marsha Blackburn asked, can you define the word woman? And she says, no, I can't. And she was unable to cross those red lines. She couldn't define what a woman is, and she could not define when human life begins, which I think is kind of intriguing because, as a couple of people have pointed out, for a person who has used the word woman time and time again, she couldn't define what a woman was. And one example of that is simply that she continuously used the word woman in her testimony. And even when she's talking to Senator Dianne Feinstein about Roe versus Wade, she talked about the fact that she believes that settled law concerning the right of a woman to terminate a pregnancy. So you just see how the left just has so dominated the language, you can't even define what a woman is or even talk about when life begins. That being said, I did want to at least post a couple of things that you might find interesting, and one of those is from Dan McLaughlin. Actually, I'm going to have two here, both by him. But he says, again, even though he recognizes she's probably going to vote the party line, it shows that this has been, as he said, a route for progressive theories on law and justice. For example, she affirmed that the Supreme Court has established the right to keep and bear arms as a fundamental right. Okay, that's Second Amendment. She disagreed with her former boss, that would be Justice Stephen Breyer, about using international law. Now, whether she will, we'll see, but nevertheless, that's what she said. She's talked movingly about people in law enforcement, about cops in her own family, and the role and need for police at a time when everybody's been talking about defunding the police. She cited how far we've come as a country, and it's a sign of greatness of America, and I hope she believes that as well. And when I even asked about Roe versus Wade, at one point, John Cornyn asked her about that, and she said, no, I've never heard of a judge describing any case as a super precedent, which means, I'm not sure she's going to change her mind on the issue of abortion, but I thought it was kind of interesting. And Dan McLaughlin put it the other way, that is Justice Antonin Scalia 1. One of our booklets, and I can hold it up for you if you'd like to see it, is on constitutional interpretation. And we make a distinction between those who are called originalists, and Antonin Scalia certainly fits into that category. Clarence Thomas does, Amy Coney Barrett does, for sure. And yet, interestingly enough, there have been most of the people that liberal presidents and Democratic presidents have put on the court who believe in a so-called living constitution, which was first put forward by President Woodrow Wilson. But nevertheless, in this piece, he talks about the fact that Antonin Scalia said, look, the United States of America was the first country in the history of the world to have a written national constitution ratified by its people and binding on the government, really the first nation to have a rule book. I was out yesterday and had Dr. Merrill Matthews here, and I was speaking, and that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the Constitution, talking about America's godly heritage and a number of things in the event that I was speaking at as well. And so you can honestly say that if you look at the groups she's been involved with, the American Constitution Society, which has been kind of against originalism, and then you got left-wing groups like Demand Justice that have been pushing her nomination, it's hard to imagine that she is not going to necessarily always vote with the liberal wing. I think she probably is further to the left even than Stephen Breyer. But she certainly couldn't say that. And if nothing else, that's a victory. She talked about the fact that, and this sounds like a person like Antonin Scalia or Amy Coney Barrett or somebody like that. She says, I'm looking at original documents. I'm focused on the original public meaning because I am constrained to interpret the text. Sometimes that should be enough, she says, to resolve the issue. She says, I do not believe there's such a thing as a living constitution that changes over time. Instead, she said, you should be looking at the text at the time of the founding as a constraint on judicial innovation and all of the rest. So even if she doesn't believe it, and maybe she does, wouldn't that be something? Again, I'm not holding out. We should be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, right? Scripture talks about that. So let's be wise. Let's be discerning. I'm not going to be put off by this, but it is intriguing that she couldn't bring herself to say anything that we who believe in the original intent of the Constitution would disagree with. And I thought it was interesting. Here's my kudos to Senator Ben Sasse. We all love Ben Sasse around here. He's a senator from Nebraska. He actually talked about this book written by Stephen Breyer called Active Liberty. First of all, the fact that a United States senator has read some of those books, I'm not even sure she's read the book. Let's give him credit where credit was due. But it was kind of the back and forth between Antonin Scalia, who's a good example of an individual that believes in the original interpretation of the Constitution, and Stephen Breyer, who believes in this living Constitution. Nevertheless, she conceded that pretty much Antonin Scalia had won that argument. And I thought, okay, and leave it to probably one of the brightest people in that room yesterday, Senator Ben Sasse, to bring it up. So kudos to him. He said a couple crazy things lately, but we'll forgive those because I thought it was pretty interesting that he dug into that book, knew what it was in, and asked her about it and got her response. So we will see. I'm not holding out a lot of promise, but you just never know. And it is, if nothing else, an illustration that you can't tell people how liberal you are because you won't get elected to office, and you can't tell people how liberal your judicial philosophy is because you might not be confirmed to the Supreme Court. So that's at least a partial victory, wouldn't you say? One of the other articles I posted, it has been one where people have been making fun of it, and if you haven't heard some other talk shows talking about it, it's a piece that came out in Bloomberg. Inflation stings most if you earn less than $100,000 a year. Okay, that's all of us, right? It's pretty pathetic. But anyways, talking about, again, if you make more than $289,000 a year, then gas prices probably don't bother you because, after all, only about 1% of your take-home pay goes to gas and oil. How about the rest of us mere mortals? Well, then she's giving some ideas. You have to know your budget to control your budget. Okay, that one was good. I like that one. But then to deal with gas prices, maybe you should consider riding the bus. If you have a bus. Okay, well, and then when it comes to food prices, maybe you just need to explore things because, after all, lentils and beans are a lot less expensive than meat. But and vegetables, they've only gone up 4%, so just eat a lot more veggies, which again is healthy, but all that. Stay away from buying in bulk because sometimes you don't save money. By the way, with prices going up, I'm not sure I agree with that, by the way. Sometimes the best investment you can be is buying a few extra cans of beans and corn and put it in your pantry. But anyway, I guess I don't know what I'm talking about because this was in Bloomberg. And then the one that caused just about everybody to roll their eyes, and there's a lot in here, so you can read it for yourself. If you got a pet, I don't recommend pet chemotherapy. These people live in worlds that you and I don't even know. And it is amazing to me, first of all, to write this. And, if you're one of those people that makes $300,000, less than $300,000 a year, here are some suggestions. Given the fact that you probably do, you're probably the last person I would take advice from. But nevertheless, we've posted that article. And also, I wanted to post one on America has a free speech problem. I posted it today. Now that I know Lathan Watts is going to be with us on Friday, we're going to bring it up again on Friday because this came from the New York Times. And I will tell you, this is written the way I would have written it, although it takes a couple of cheap shots at conservatives. Well, some of them maybe even legitimate. But nevertheless, it's actually arguing that we have a problem with a cancel culture, that a lot of people have been afraid to speak their mind on everything from religion to politics. And this comes from the surveys they've done. And as a result, they actually say that free speech used to be a liberal idea. And the implication of that is, where are our fellow liberals? Because mostly liberals read the New York Times. Of course, I got a subscription to it as well. But nevertheless, where are our fellow liberals standing up for free speech? And I would say, 3 cheers for the New York Times. But it has been criticized. They've even called for the entire editorial board of the New York Times to resign over this editorial, saying America has a free speech problem. We'll probably talk more about it on Friday, but I thought I'd mention it today and let you read it in its entirety, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just, as a program note, mention that tomorrow Natasha Crane will be with us. Going to be talking about this new book, Faithfully Different. And then in the second hour, we'll do just a short interview with an individual who is actually Jewish, but wants to, again, address this issue of anti-Semitism, which has shown its head. And then we'll get back to some of the other issues in the news. But I would like to start the conversation this hour, and maybe we'll continue it next hour tomorrow and maybe even on Friday, because you might remember back in February 24th, President Biden gave a press conference, and he was asked about the impact of these sanctions. And he said, well, these are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Well, if you look at your calendar, today is a month later. Actually, tomorrow will be technically the month to March 24th, but close enough. And, of course, we're starting to see that the Russian economy, according to this article I have in front of me here, and its citizens are really being hit hard with some of the sanctions. As a matter of fact, the BBC reports that Russian supermarkets are actually restricting the purchase of certain items. 1 bag of flour per person, 1 container of salt, no more than 3 bottles of vegetable oil, no more than 3 kilograms of rice, and the list goes on and on. But we also have seen that maybe Russia is not as rich as we thought. You know, when you see the oligarchs, you think, well, everybody's wealthy. No, they're not. As a matter of fact, you saw the number of Russian soldiers that came into Ukraine that are under-equipped and undersupplied. The maintenance of some of the Russian military vehicles, according to this particular article, was inadequate. You saw that the Russian troops oftentimes went into these places to loot food a few days in the campaign because apparently they did not have enough provisions. And so, of course, Russia is suffering. And the sad point is it's not Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs that are suffering. It is the Russian people. But I thought for just a few minutes, what are the sanctions doing to us? And I'm going to give you a fuller list on Friday. But first of all, look at what it's doing right now to global energy prices. Russia is a major exporter of both oil and gas. 10% of the global oil supply comes from Russia. 1/3 of the gas that goes to Europe comes from Russia. With all the disruptions in supply, I think you can kind of figure out what has happened there. And so you now have countries like Germany, like Hungary, and others looking for alternatives. They really don't have any alternatives. And so that's the case. So first of all, it's expensive because you don't have as much availability of those energy supplies. But secondarily, under that, you also have the cost of getting the energy to market because you've had the U.S. and the U.K. actually that have had an embargo on Russian oil. Doug reminded me that gas is $114 a barrel. Oh, my goodness. Just keeps going up. And, of course, you know, oil can't even make it into some of the countries because you've got some of those countries that are too reliant on Russian energy. So the price of gas, oil, energy going up. Number two, these are things people don't think about, but you hear them here on Point of View. Maybe you hear them on Bloomberg or CNBC. Probably not, but let me give them to you. Russia is not only a great exporter of oil and gas and energy, but metals, aluminum, palladium, and nickel, for example. And you might say nickel, well, the cost of nickel is nearly doubled. And what do you use nickel for? Well, we use it for batteries and for armor plating, turbine blades. This one's from my producer. Nickel's used in electric guitar strings, if you did not know that. So just dug that one out of the file there as well. Number three, how about food? I'm tempted to put this one up here right now. It's kind of hard to see, but this is a graph on the fact that Russia and Ukraine together are the breadbasket of the world. Now, Ukraine for years has been called the breadbasket of Europe. And again, Doug's shaking his head because we've had that conversation off air as well. The quarter of the world's wheat is produced by Russia and Ukraine. What's happening right now? Well, Russian tanks are running all over that land, and nobody's actually planting anything. Then, for the few farmers that have been able to plant it, the cost of distributing the commodities has become prohibitive. And do I need to explain why? I hope not. The cost of wheat then has increased significantly. And then when you add to it that there's a number of countries, a lot of them tend to be in Africa, but not exclusively, they just lack the money to even buy the food in the first place. By the way, if you're not familiar, some of the reasons there have been some of the great revolutions in history have been because of the lack of food. Remember the Arab Spring? That was due to the price of food. And if you can't even afford bread. Think about what that means. But there's more. Oh, yes, I'm just a regular bluebird of happiness today, aren't I? Russia is also the biggest exporter of potash. You say, what's potash? Well, Russia and Belarus actually are the largest producers in the world, and potash is used in the production of fertilizer. Well, a fertilizer is very important because we have now the green revolution agriculture, so fertilizer is essential in growing all sorts of crops, and Russia actually has banned the export of the fertilizer. And so it means what? Well, food prices are going to go up, right? And the high price of food and the lack of food, as I mentioned before, could be the reasons for revolution. And one last, because we're running out of time, there's also the rise in cost of transporting those goods around the world. Because, first of all, we've had a problem with our global supply chains that have already been strained. Now we have the sanctions against Russia that have actually increased the cost of logistics. Ships, for example, are refusing to dock in Russian ports. Russian ships are being refused to dock in Western ports. And so as a result, you might want to say, well, I'll use rail shipping. Except you have to look at the China-Europe railway that runs through Russia. And Russia's not letting them come through the railway. Okay, so I'll use air freight. Oh, well, same problem. First of all, it's more expensive. Second of all, Russia won't allow some of them to fly over the Russian area. And if you're flying from Europe to whatever, Southeast Asia or China or Japan, how do you get there? You have to avoid Russia. And so, of course, then we have all sorts of additional regulations because of the sanctions. And then, of course, let's just admit it, Ukraine has had to shut down a lot of her ports because, guess what? The war. And those that are actually going to the ports have to pay more for insurance because if you're an insurance company, wouldn't you want to raise the premiums because you don't know whether or not that ship in that port might get bombed by Russia, and you can kind of do the math. So I'm not trying to scare anybody, but I'm oftentimes wanting to at least help you understand that the sanctions, they may be working. They may be bringing Russia to its knees. It hasn't changed Vladimir Putin's mindset, I don't think. It's hurting the Russian people. But guess what? We're going to pay a very significant price here in America. Nothing like the price that the Ukrainian people are facing. But at the same time, some people like to know what will be the impact. And don't come back and say, well, then you are, again, you're actually for Russia. No, I'm not for Russia. But at the same time, you can be against Russia and against the invasion, and at the same time pointing out that these sanctions probably will hurt a lot of us in the listening audience. And it's maybe time to pay attention to some of that. And if nothing else, make appropriate decisions about your food and resources, because we may be in for a little bit of a new series of crises. This one not from the pandemic and lockdowns. This one comes from the sanctions. Anyway, Doug, I want to thank you for your help, not only as an engineer, but also my economic advisor. Steve, glad to have you back here as well. But let's, if we can, encourage you to join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.